They said, "You don't belong here anymore." But what they didn't know was, I built that home with my own hands, and I'm not leaving what I've already made safe. My name is Clara Dawson, 40 years old, an architect, and a single mother to my 8-year-old daughter, Ruby. I design schools for a living, places where children learn what safety feels like. I never imagined I'd have to fight for that same feeling inside my own family. 2 years ago, after my divorce, Ruby and I moved into the small carriage house behind my parents' property. It was old, leaking, forgotten, but I saw potential where they saw decay. I rewired the lights, patched the walls, fixed the roof myself. I paid for every screw and beam. My parents said it was temporary, but to me it was home, a place Ruby could laugh without hearing arguments through the walls. If you're watching this right now, take a moment. Tell me where you're listening from. Maybe share what home means to you. Because what I'm about to share isn't about anger. It's about justice, love, and the quiet courage of standing up when silence becomes too heavy. The shift began at a Sunday dinner. The table smelled like lemon and roasted chicken. My brother Evan lifted his wine and said casually, "That little house behind the yard, it's perfect for my first home." My mother smiled. My father nodded. No one looked at me. In that silence, something inside me cracked, not from rage but from clarity. For years I had believed that being the reliable daughter meant never saying no. That night, I understood. When people mistake your generosity for permission, it's time to draw a line. Ruby, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand as if she already knew this moment would change everything. I smiled at her, not to hide the pain, but to promise her something deeper. That no one, not even family, should decide where we belong. And if you've ever had to choose between peace and pleasing others, leave a comment below. Because sometimes sharing your story is the first way to rebuild what was almost taken from you. That night, after Ruby fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, tracing the lines of the house I had rebuilt. The quiet hum of the old refrigerator filled the room, steady and faithful, just like the life I'd been trying to hold together. From outside, I could see the faint glow of my parents' house, close enough to touch, yet suddenly miles away. The next morning, I found a letter on the porch, a white envelope. No return address, just my name in my mother's handwriting. Inside was a formal notice, pages stamped, numbered, and cold. Plaintiffs, Henry and Margaret Dawson. Defendant, Clara Dawson. It didn't make sense. My parents had filed to evict me. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe some mix-up with property lines or paperwork, but the second page erased that hope. My brother's name appeared under intended buyer. They weren't confused. They were making room. The words didn't sting right away. They settled slowly, like dust in sunlight. I had spent years repairing this family's leaks, financial, emotional, even structural, and now I was being written out like a bad blueprint. I called my father that afternoon. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady, practiced. "Sweetheart, it's not personal," he said. "Evan needs a start." "I understand," I said, though my throat tightened. "But you're asking me to leave the home I built for my daughter." There was silence. Then softly he replied, "You'll find another place." "You always do." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. You always do. As if resilience were permission to keep being hurt. That evening, I walked through every room of the cottage, the walls I'd painted, the shelves Ruby had helped me sand, the garden we'd planted from seed. Each space held proof of our effort, our care. If they wanted facts, I would give them facts, not out of anger, but out of truth. So I gathered everything, receipts, photos, utility payments, texts from my mother thanking me for covering taxes. Every memory turned into evidence, because when people try to rewrite your story, paper remembers what hearts sometimes forget. And that night, as I tucked Ruby into bed, I whispered to her, "We're not leaving, sweetheart." Not this time. The court date came faster than I expected. Weeks of uneasy silence stretched between my parents' house and mine, broken only by the sound of Ruby's laughter, the only proof that life still had softness left in it. Every morning she drew something new, our little cottage, the lavender garden, the words, "Home is safe." I kept those drawings on the fridge like small anchors, reminders of what I was fighting for. The morning of the hearing was gray and heavy with drizzle. I dressed Ruby for school, packed her lunch, and tried to smile like everything was fine. She looked up at me and asked, "Mom, are they still mad at us?" I wanted to say no, but lies don't hold well in front of children who notice everything. "They're just confused," I said softly, "but the truth will clear things up." In court, the air smelled like old paper and nervous perfume. My parents sat on the opposite bench, close together, avoiding my eyes. My brother, in a new suit, looked proud, as if the house was already his. Their lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth, practiced, and distant. Words like trespasser, license revoked, unauthorized occupant echoed through the room. Each phrase chipped away at the years I'd spent believing family meant something unbreakable. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. I told the judge the truth, that I had paid for repairs, for taxes, for every piece of that small house, that I had proof, and I laid the folder down on the table. The papers made a soft sound, but it carried. The judge listened carefully, her eyes calm and unreadable. She asked questions, not about money, but about intention. "Did your parents ever tell you to stop paying? Did they ever refuse your help?" "No," I said quietly. "They just stopped saying thank you." Behind me, Ruby sat beside my friend from work, clutching her tablet like a secret she didn't want to share yet. I didn't know what she'd recorded. Not then. Only that she had been watching, listening. And in that courtroom filled with family and strangers, I realized something important. Sometimes justice isn't loud or cruel. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing the face of a 7-year-old who still believes in the truth. The hearing stretched on through the afternoon, each side taking turns, shaping the same story into 2 different versions of truth. My parents' lawyer spoke with polished certainty about property rights, boundaries, and family generosity gone too far. Every sentence felt like a carefully measured insult wrapped in politeness. When he finished, the judge turned to me again. "Ms. Dawson," she said gently, "is there anything else you'd like to add?" I hesitated, then shook my head. I'd already shown the receipts, the texts, the bank transfers. The truth was there, printed in black ink. I thought the case was over, until I felt a small hand tug my sleeve. It was Ruby. She looked up at me, her brown eyes steady, braver than I'd ever been at her age. "Mom," she whispered, "can I show the judge something?" I frowned, confused. Before I could answer, she stood up, clutching her tablet in both hands. "Your Honor," she said softly, "can I show you something Daddy doesn't know?" The judge blinked, then nodded slowly. The courtroom went still as Ruby walked to the front, her shoes tapping lightly against the floor. She handed the tablet to the bailiff. "It's a video," she explained, "from our camera at home." The screen flickered to life. The video showed a sunny afternoon in our cottage, and then the door opening. My mother and brother stepped inside while I was at work. My mother rifled through the mail on my desk. My brother walked toward the carbon monoxide detector, reached up, and pulled out the battery. On the recording, my mother's voice said, "Evan, don't touch that." "It's fine," he replied. "If the inspector says it's unsafe, she'll have to move out." The room fell silent. My father's face turned pale. My mother stared at the floor. The judge stopped the video halfway through. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Ms. Dawson," she said to my mother, her tone calm but cold, "what I see here is not a misunderstanding. It's an attempt to manipulate a safety inspection." I looked at Ruby, who was now sitting back down, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't smile or cry. She just breathed out, relieved, like a child who had finally told the truth and set something right again. The silence that followed felt heavier than any verdict. My parents didn't speak. Even their lawyer seemed unsure what to say. The judge folded her hands, her expression calm but unyielding. She turned to my parents and brother with a voice that carried no anger, only finality. "What I've just seen," she said, "isn't a dispute about ownership. It's a breach of trust." She paused, letting the words settle like dust. "You came to this court asking for equity, yet equity demands conscience. And from what I've seen, conscience was missing long before this lawsuit." No one moved. My mother's eyes glistened. My father kept staring at the table as if searching for a version of events that could still make sense. Evan swallowed hard, but said nothing. The judge continued, her tone still steady. "The petition for eviction is denied. Permanently. Furthermore, the plaintiffs are prohibited from entering the defendant's residence without explicit permission. It was over. Quietly, completely. No shouting, no applause. Just a soft thud of the gavel and the sound of truth landing where it belonged. I felt Ruby's hand slip into mine. She looked up, not triumphant, just calm. "We can go home now?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered. "We can." As we stepped outside, the late afternoon light poured through the courthouse windows. I didn't feel victory, only release, the kind that doesn't come from winning, but from finally being done with pretending. My parents didn't follow us out. For a moment I almost turned back, almost reached for them. But then I remembered the video, the letter, the quiet betrayal they had named love. Some truths you can forgive but you can't unknow. In the parking lot, Ruby stopped and looked at me. Was I in trouble for showing the video? I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "No, sweetheart," I said. "You told the truth. You did the right thing." She smiled faintly. It felt scary. "It always does," I told her. "But courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you speak anyway." We drove home in silence. For the first time in months, the little house didn't feel small. It felt steady. Ours. The lavender by the window swayed gently in the wind, and for once, the air smelled like peace. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No more letters. No more phone calls from numbers I didn't want to answer. Just the rhythm of normal life returning, the hum of the refrigerator, Ruby's laughter echoing from her room, the smell of morning coffee. After months of tension, the silence felt almost sacred. But peace, I learned, doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small, careful steps. The first was changing the locks. I hired a locksmith, not because I wanted to shut people out, but because I needed to feel that the door I closed would stay closed unless I chose otherwise. The man worked in silence, then handed me a new set of keys. They were cold in my palm, heavier than they looked. That evening, Ruby helped me label them. "One for you, one for me," she said proudly, attaching a pink ribbon to hers. I smiled. "Now no one can come in unless we open the door." She nodded, satisfied, the way children are when the world suddenly makes sense again. A week later, my father showed up on the sidewalk. He didn't cross the gate. Maybe he knew he wasn't allowed to, or maybe he finally understood that he shouldn't. He looked older than I remembered. "Your mother's been crying," he said quietly. "We never meant for it to go this far." "I know," I replied. "But it did." He looked at the garden, at Ruby's lavender, at the walls I'd built. "You really made this place your own." "I had to," I said. "You taught me to fix things." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I realized forgiveness didn't have to mean reunion. It could simply mean not carrying the weight any longer. When he left, I watched his figure fade past the hedges, the way old stories fade when they've finally been told. That night, as I tucked Ruby into bed, she whispered, "We're safe now, right?" I nodded. "Yes, sweetheart." We're home. The light from her lamp spilled across the drawings on the wall, houses, trees, and a small sign she'd written in bright blue marker, "Home, built by love, kept by truth." Autumn came early that year, softening everything except memory. The garden behind our house was full of lavender and dry leaves, the same mix of scent and sound that once meant family dinners and shared laughter. Now it just meant quiet. My parents hadn't called since that day outside the gate, and even though I told myself that peace was enough, forgiveness kept knocking somewhere inside me, gentle, persistent, inconvenient. One Saturday morning, while Ruby was drawing by the window, I found an envelope slipped through the mail slot. No stamps this time, just my mother's handwriting, smaller, shakier than I remembered. Inside was a letter, 3 short lines. "We overreacted. We're sorry. Let's talk." There was no signature, just the faint scent of her hand cream, the same one she used when she braided my hair as a child. I read it twice, then folded it back carefully. It didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like regret wrapped in pride, still unsure how to say the right thing out loud. That night, I placed the letter in Ruby's keepsake box, not because I wanted to hold on to the pain, but because I wanted to remember how healing begins, slowly, imperfectly. A few days later, Ruby asked, "Will Grandma come back for dinner?" "Maybe," I said, "but this time if she does, she'll knock first." Ruby smiled at that. "Then we can open the door when we're ready." I watched her go back to her drawing, a house, 2 women, and a door standing slightly open. For the first time, the house looked balanced. I started writing a reply that night, not a letter of forgiveness, but one of boundaries. I told my parents that I loved them, that I understood fear can twist even good intentions, but also that our home was not open ground anymore. Respect had to be rebuilt like walls after a storm, brick by brick, promise by promise. When I sealed the envelope, I felt lighter. Healing, I realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming the space between hurt and peace, the same way I'd once rebuilt that cottage, patiently, with care. Outside, the wind moved through the lavender, carrying the faint sound of Ruby humming to herself, the sound of a home learning to breathe again. A week after sending my letter, life began to settle into a rhythm that finally felt real. The house no longer carried the weight of tension, only the ordinary sounds of living, the squeak of the screen door, the hum of the kettle, the quiet clicking of Ruby's colored pencils as she drew at the kitchen table. Peace, I learned, wasn't loud. It was made of small, repetitive sounds that reminded you you'd survived. Then, one Sunday afternoon, the phone rang. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer. Her voice was thin, uncertain, softer than I'd ever heard it. "Clara," she said, "your father isn't well." "Just a cold, but he keeps asking about Ruby." There was a pause, a long one. Then she added, "We know we hurt you, but could we come by?" Just for a few minutes, I looked toward Ruby, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, building a small house out of old cereal boxes. "If you come," I said slowly, "you'll have to knock. And I'll have to think about opening the door." "I understand," she whispered. The next afternoon, there was a knock, 2 soft taps, hesitant. Ruby looked at me. "Is that them?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Let's see what ready feels like." I opened the door halfway. My parents stood there. Older, smaller somehow. My mother held a pie, the same kind she used to bake on Sundays. My father kept his hands in his coat pockets, eyes lowered. "We brought something for Ruby," my mother said. "And for you, if you'll take it." We didn't talk much that day. They sat on the porch while Ruby showed them her tiny paper house. My father smiled at her, a little unsure, like a man learning a new language. When they left, he turned to me and said, "You really did build a good home." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but maybe it didn't need to be. That evening, Ruby asked, "Are they still family?" I nodded. "Yes, just family we keep at the door for now." She thought for a moment, then said, "That's okay. Doors can open and close, but walls don't have to fall." I watched her tape another drawing to the fridge, 3 houses side by side, each with a small path leading toward the other. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was peace, learning to take its first quiet steps back home. Winter arrived gently that year, folding the town in quiet light. The lavender by the window had turned silver, but the house still smelled faintly of warmth, cinnamon, old wood, and something like forgiveness. My parents hadn't returned since that day on the porch, but they'd started writing small notes, not long messages, just fragments. "Hope Ruby liked the pie. We're proud of you." Each one short, cautious, testing the distance between us. I didn't reply right away. Some silences aren't about anger, they're about giving truth enough room to breathe. And in that quiet, Ruby thrived. She was reading chapter books now, painting walls with little stars, learning to bake muffins that filled the house with laughter. Every time she called, "Mom, come see!" I thought of how far we'd come from those months of fear and courtrooms. One evening, I took down a box from the top shelf, the one with old family photographs. There we were, birthdays, vacations, hands linked across tables that no longer exist. I studied my parents' faces, younger, open, unaware of how love can twist when it tries too hard to control. For a long time, I thought those pictures would only hurt. But that night, I saw something else. Proof that good intentions once lived here too. Maybe they just got buried under years of habit and pride. I began to understand that healing doesn't mean restoring what was. It means redesigning what still can be, like reinforcing a cracked foundation so the house can stand again. A few weeks later, I drove by my parents' place after work. Their lights were on, faint behind drawn curtains. I didn't stop, just slowed down enough to see the outline of their figures at the dinner table. It wasn't sadness I felt, just a quiet knowing that this was where they belonged now, and I where I belonged. 2 houses, 2 stories, still connected by something invisible and stubbornly human. That night, I told Ruby a story, not about betrayal or loss, but about building. About how every home has to be rebuilt more than once, sometimes from scratch, sometimes from forgiveness. She listened with her chin tucked into her blanket. "So we're still a family?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "just a family learning new blueprints." She smiled, drifting toward sleep, and I thought, maybe that's what healing really is. Not returning to the old house, but learning how to draw a new one, together, even from afar. Spring came quietly, carrying the scent of rain through the open windows. The lavender that had withered in winter began to bloom again, a small reminder that life always knows how to start over. Ruby and I spent our weekends sanding the porch, painting, baking, ordinary things that once felt unreachable. Ordinary had become a kind of miracle. One Sunday morning, as sunlight touched the kitchen floor, I found Ruby sitting by the window, writing in her notebook. On the page, she had drawn 3 houses, each with a small heart above the door. "One for us," she said, "one for Grandma and Grandpa, and one for people who need to feel safe." I didn't correct her, I just nodded. Sometimes children understand healing long before adults do. Later that day, I walked outside with my coffee, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. The same wind that once carried arguments now carried peace. I thought about my parents, about love that tried too hard to control, about mistakes that taught me the meaning of boundaries. I wasn't angry anymore. I was grateful, not for what happened, but for what it revealed. I had learned that justice isn't punishment. It's clarity. It's when the truth stands firm enough that no one has to raise their voice. And healing isn't forgetting. It's learning how to live without reopening the wound. That evening, I placed the last of Ruby's drawings on the wall, a small sign she'd written in purple ink. "Home means we choose kindness first." It made me smile, because maybe that was the real ending. Not the court, not the locks, not even forgiveness, but the quiet decision to keep choosing love without surrendering yourself. I looked around our little house, the walls we rebuilt, the laughter returning to each corner, and I realized this wasn't the story of losing a family. It was the story of learning how to build one again, stronger, honest, and free. If this story reached you, if it reminded you that peace doesn't mean silence, but understanding, take a moment to tap the like button, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Because sometimes, the stories that heal us are the ones we choose to tell, and the ones that remind us that justice and love can live under the same roof.